Amen. We are starting a new series on the book of Ruth. This is an Old Testament story that teaches us about what to do when life gets hard. What to do when life just turns into chaos and confusion, when it feels like God is far away. You know, I love this book because it shows how God works in the midst of our struggles. That even when we can't feel Him, even when we cry out, even when we feel like it's not just that He's not there, it's almost like He's turned against us. Have you ever felt that way? Even then, God is still with us, and He still loves us, and He's still working in our lives, and He's always bringing about redemption and restoration. If you've ever gone through something difficult, like Ruth in this book, like Naomi in this book, like this book teaches, a health crisis, a loss of a job, maybe even a loss of an unexpected family member, somebody passing away, you might have encountered one of these well-meaning but unhelpful cliches. Something like, everything happens for a reason. Maybe that's been said to you in the midst of that. And while it might be nice and it might sound good, it feels like somebody's kind of minimizing your pain and what you're going through. And you're telling me that this loss I've experienced, it's God did this to me? Is that what that means? Or maybe you've heard that God is testing you. I didn't know my faith was transactional and that every problem I had was a test. And He's just toying with my life. Maybe you've heard you just need to have more faith. Maybe you've been crying or weeping over a loss of someone you love and somebody said that to you. And while you know there might be truth there, you also know that your faith is the only thing holding you. It's the only thing keeping you going. And you're saying, I have all the faith I can muster right now. Maybe you've heard God won't give you more than you can handle. And while that is scripture, it's a quote. It's not a quote about our struggles. It's a quote about temptation. You will never be tempted in a way that is more than you can handle. God will always provide a way out of whatever temptation you go through. This verse is not about your life will never get really, really hard. And sometimes life does give you more than you can handle. And that's why you need to lean on God in those moments. And like the story of Naomi and Ruth, sometimes you need to lean on a friend because it is more than I can handle right now. And I need someone to walk through this with me. This is one of the reasons I love the Bible, because God did not write us a rule manual. He did not write us, it's not IKEA instructions for life. Step-by-step drawings for exactly how. Now, it would be nice if this was a doctoral thesis and it explained how to deal with hard times. When you go through hard times, do this, this, and this, and everything will get better. That would be nice, but that's not what we get. Instead, what we get are stories of people who went through hard times. We get stories like Job, someone who goes through terrible situations, but in the end, God brings about good. We get stories like Naomi in the book of Ruth, who goes through terrible tragedies. But in the end, God brings about good. He doesn't give up on her. He never leaves her or forsakes her. Because the reality is, all of our pain, it's real. The struggles that we go through, they're real. And we can't just minimize them into a rule book, a set of do X, Y, and Z, and everything will get better. There's no prescription for how long we should mourn, how long we should struggle, how long we should suffer. What there is are stories of people who have persevered, and God has redeemed and restored their situation. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about. So let's turn into this book. It's right after the book of Judges, so it's pretty early in the Old Testament. We're going to start in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. It'll also be up on the screen. And it begins like this. In those days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And I'm going to stop there because already this line gives us a lot of important context for the story we're about to hear. First off, it tells us that this story takes place in the time of Judges. So this is after the people have been enslaved in Egypt and been freed by God. They've already gone through the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and they've gone through the battles as they tried to take the promised land. And now they've settled in the place that God said would be a land flowing with milk and honey. A land that would provide for your needs. But the problem is, once they entered into that land of promise, they forgot the God who brought them there. Which is why all throughout their journey, when they were freed from Egypt, immediately the first thing God did was say, remember the Passover. Every year, celebrate this moment where I freed you. Because the thing is, you're going to forget. You're going to forget what it was like to be in slavery, and if you're not careful, you'll either go back to slavery or you'll become a slaver. And then when they cross the Jordan River, God immediately stops them and says, stack up some rocks and leave them there as a monument to this moment so that someday when you walk by with your kids or your grandkids, they're going to ask you, why are those rocks there? And you'll be able to tell them the story of when God parted the seas and freed us. Because the reality is, God doesn't part the seas every day. So sometimes we have to look back and remember the good that He's already done in our lives to get us through the pain that we're going through right now. Sometimes you need to remember that God was faithful and He'll be faithful again. But they'd forgotten. There was no king yet, so they were being ruled by these judges. And if you remember the book of Judges, we studied this like 4 or 5 years ago. There was this cycle that the people were in where they would rebel against God. They would turn their backs on Him. And then things would go terribly. They would go through some crisis. So an army would invade. And because they had turned their back on God, God would kind of say, okay, if you don't want my help, I won't help. You know, a lot of times when we hear these verses in the Old Testament about like God's hand judging a city or doing something terrible, it's not really that God is doing something, it's that God is withdrawing Himself from the situation, just like we asked. When we live and say to God over and over, we don't need you, we don't want you, don't help us, we're going to worship other gods because they're better, they give us more gifts, they're nicer to us, we don't need you, God. Then when the army stands at our doorstep, sometimes God will just say, okay, you didn't want my help, you didn't want to obey my rules, you didn't want to follow my commands, take care of this yourselves. Well, that would happen, and the people would repent. And they would cry out to God, God, we're so sorry. And they would turn back and they'd cast down their idols and they'd burn up their worship temples and they'd say, God, we're coming back to you. And God would stop the judgment. He'd stop the pain. He'd stop the sorrow. And for a little while, things would go good, and then they would forget. And they'd restart the cycle over and over and over again. And so when you read the book of Judges, you get the idea of this cycle, but there's always this question about what about the innocent ones? You know, when God is dealing with a community, a city, a culture, it's really easy to say, okay, yeah, they're rebelling against God. They deserve to get what's coming their way. But what about the innocent people who are just going about their daily lives, who get caught up in the struggle and the trials and the battles? That's what the story of Ruth is about. It's about a normal family who's caught in a famine. This is one of the experiences that the people were going through that was going to turn them as a community back to God. They would say to God, God, we're sorry we've rejected you. Send rain. You know, you're the God who puts rain on the harvest, but you're also the God that can hold it back. So God, we're sorry. Send rain. Well, right now they're rebelling. and there's no rain. And we get this zoomed-in story of Naomi and her family. These Israelite people who came to the land of promise thinking that everything would go well for them, and then now they're stuck in a famine. The story continues. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. All right, so we get some more context for our story. First, we get these names. And I think these names give us kind of a picture of what was going on in the lives of these people. So Elimelech means God is king. It's a very powerful name, a good name. Naomi's name means pleasant. Their sons' names are sickly and frail. You know, when things are going good, we'll name our children God is king and pleasant. But things were going so bad for the people that even their children were getting the name sickly and frail, because that's what life looked like. Now, these boys were probably about pre-teens when their family decided, we can't stay here anymore. Bethlehem is the city of bread. That's what Bethlehem means, but there was no bread in Bethlehem. So they begin looking outside, and they go to Moab. Now, the Moabites were descendants of sort of one of the most awful stories in the Old Testament, the story of Lot and his daughters, where his daughters end up taking advantage of their father. They get him drunk, and they sleep with him and have an incestual relationship and have children from that. And the Moabites trace their lineage back to that moment. They're the child of that incestual relationship. And from that point on, they were in constant conflict with the Israelites. In fact, it's the Moabite king who hired the prophet Balaam to speak curses over Israel when they were coming into the promised land. If you remember this story, it's where the talking donkey, right? Okay, this is one of those weird Bible stories. A donkey turns around to the prophet and is like, I'm not going, there's an angel in the road. And Balaam starts beating the donkey, and the donkey's like, stop. I mean, it's literally like it sounds like it's out of Shrek, but this is a story in the Bible. You can look it up. That was the Moabite king who hired that prophet to curse Israel, to stop them from entering into the promised land. They went to war against each other. The Moabites worshipped pagan gods and idols, and they took part in child sacrifice. To go from the promised land to Moab was to do the unthinkable. And I'm sure that Naomi and Elimelech did not make this choice easily. I'm sure it didn't come quickly. They probably suffered for years through this famine, and eventually they just said, we have to go somewhere. I heard there might be food in Moab. Let's just go there. And yes, we know that it's our enemy. We know that it's these people who are they're idol worshipers, and they worship false gods, and they're kind of terrible people. But at this point we just got to feed our kids. You ever been stuck in that kind of situation where maybe you're going through a job crisis and you don't know what to do, and you're asking God, what do we do? What do we do? I want to make sure I'm in God's will. I don't want to make the wrong choice. I don't know. It doesn't tell us in the story if they made the right or wrong choice to go to Moab, but things don't get better for them when they leave. But here's the thing. They make maybe the wrong choice, but God does not give up on them. I think a lot of times when I hear people say, I have these 2 job offers, I don't know which one to take. I want to make sure I'm staying in God's will. One's going to move me here, one's going to keep me there. God's will goes with us wherever we go. Now, He might have a direction He wants us to take, but if you choose wrong, it doesn't mean that God leaves you and forsakes you. It doesn't mean that His plans for your life are ruined. That minimizes God down when we try to put Him into that. God can work even through our failures. And that's what he does through this family when they go to Moab. It says in verses 3 through 5, now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And after they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her sons and her husband. In just 5 verses, we're just 5 verses into the book of Ruth, Naomi's family has had to move from the promised land, from their home, a place that they've always known, because of famine. They've left their people and their God behind. They went to a place where they thought there was hope, and instead, Naomi's life fell apart. She lost her husband and her 2 sons, and now she's left with 2 foreign widows that are now her responsibility to care for. She has no prospects. She has no way of earning an income. She's in a foreign land. She doesn't even have family to turn to. She's all alone. You know, I'm sure when they were in Bethlehem having these conversations about moving to Moab, I'm sure their life didn't feel very full in that moment. It's hard to feel full when you're going through a famine. But I bet if Naomi could have changed things, she would say, if I could have my family, I would live through the famine. Sometimes the grass is not always greener in Moab. Sometimes those struggles still come. You know, the text here, this Hebrew text, these 5 verses, packs so much time. We've gone through about 20-ish years of time in 5 verses because that's what pain feels like. That's what struggle feels like. I don't know if it lasts a week or it lasts 10 years, but it feels like it's just our entire life is consumed by hardship. I'm sure not every day of Naomi's life in Moab was bad. I'm sure they had nice days out. I'm sure there were good days in Bethlehem, even in the midst of the famine. But when you're going through struggle, this is what they talk about with depression. It clouds everything, every feeling. There is no hope. There are no rainbows. There is no sunshine, even when there is, because the struggle is just so thick. But here's what's fascinating. There's no moral lesson here. The narrator of the story does not tell us that they made wrong choices. He doesn't say this is all happening because Naomi was so sinful or her kids were so bad. There is no moral consequence. There's just loss. I think when we go through loss, we always want to know why. Why am I going through hardship? Why am I experiencing pain? Sometimes there is no good answer. Sometimes loss is just loss. But verse 6 quietly gives us a hint that there's hope. It says, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, this is back in Bethlehem, she hears that there's bread in Bethlehem again. She and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. She left Bethlehem because there were no prospects, and now she's leaving Moab because there are no prospects. But God has sent rain on Bethlehem. God did provide. God did come through. Sometimes redemption does not come through some miraculous moment. It comes through just a little bit of rainfall. Sometimes it comes through just a single step in the right direction. It's not turning our entire life around. It's just saying, okay, maybe I can go back home. Maybe I just need to take a step back towards my community that loves me. Maybe I just need to take a step back towards Jesus. Maybe I don't have to get myself completely figured out. Maybe this won't make everything go away, but maybe I just need to step into what I know to be true. That God is the provider. So she begins to walk home. In verse 8, though, Naomi says to her daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." And listen to what Naomi says. But Naomi said to them, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. And even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this, they wept aloud. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to return or to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. On the road home, Naomi has this moment where she feels like she's just dragging these two women down with her. If they go with her, they're giving up the prospects of having hope. They're giving up the idea of having new husbands. She says, "Go back, just go back and build a life for yourselves. I release you from any responsibility that you feel for me." I wonder if Naomi is honestly thinking in this moment, maybe I'll never make it to Bethlehem. Maybe I'll start this journey and I'll walk alone and I'll just stop. And God will take me and I'll be done because this suffering is too much for me. But if these two girls go with me, I'll have to keep going. If they stay with me, I'll have a reason to keep on because I'll have the responsibility for them. So I'm just going to send them back home so I can just do what I need to do. She says, "The hand of the Lord has gone out against me." She sees this as God's judgment on her life. She feels like God is punishing her. She interprets her pain as God's judgment. But it's interesting, Naomi doesn't curse God in this moment. She doesn't give up on God. She just names her pain. And throughout Scripture, there's a word for this. It's called lament. If you read the book of Psalms for very long at all, you will find psalms of lament where David is going through terrible situations. He's being hunted by the king. The lives of his men are in his hand, and he's dragged them out into the desert. They're starving. They're living off scraps, and he feels that responsibility. He cries out to God, "God, why am I going through this? Why would you name me king while there's still a king who was my friend, who now wants to kill me?" And then there's laments. David laments when he's committed sins. And he cries out to God, "God, I don't know why I'm struggling. I don't know why I'm suffering. I don't know why my life is going like this." And there's moments in David's life where he's done nothing wrong, but life gets difficult, and he cries out, "God." In fact, the very words that Jesus says on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" come from a lament of David. He is quoting David when he cries out those words. And never once in the book of Psalms or the book of Job or the book of Lamentations does God condemn the lamenter. Never once are we told that they were wrong to cry out in their pain, that they were wrong to ask God why. Why am I hurting? Why am I struggling? God wants us to name our pain. God wants us to be honest about our struggles. In fact, the ancient Jewish understanding of this part of the book of Ruth, she is held up as a standard for what real faith looks like, because real faith is willing to name its pain. It's willing to cry out to God and say, God, I feel like you're against me. I feel like everything is going wrong and I don't know why. God, what is going on? Where are you? But real faith keeps walking with God. It gives God the opportunity to provide the answer. It gives God the opportunity to keep working. Now, Orpah, she turns back and she heads home. And in fact, her name means back of neck, which is what Naomi will see as she walks away. But Ruth's name means friend. And Ruth clings to Naomi. That word cling is the same word from Genesis 2:24 when God first describes what marriage will be. He says, a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. Listen to the words that Ruth says to Naomi. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. Your people, they're going to be my people. Your God is going to be my God. When you die, I want to be buried next to you. It's covenantal love that Ruth shows to Naomi. But it's not only just love, it's conversion. Now, this is crazy because when you're going through hard times, you don't feel like you're a good example for other people to look up to, right? When you're going through a difficult time, it's not exactly like, okay, I need to go evangelize my friends and tell them about the goodness of God. When I'm sitting in my room screaming at God, God, why am I going through this? God, why have you forsaken me? But Ruth, a pagan, she sees Naomi's faith in the midst of struggle. She sees the honest faith that Naomi has as she walks through difficult times, and she falls in love with God. Because sometimes our struggles are what the world needs to see. When we try to pretend like we've got it all together, when we try to pretend like being a Christian means you'll never go through a difficult situation for the rest of your life, that there's some sort of secret formula that if you say, I believe in Jesus, I'll never stub my toe again, we give people a false idea of what faith looks like. Sometimes we need to lament. Sometimes we need to cry. Sometimes we need to hurt. Because the world needs to see that we still persevere in the midst of pain. I remember a professor of mine, when I was in college, they were going through an issue. They weren't able to have children, him and his wife. And he said he had to stop going to church during that season. He said, it felt so wrong. I'm a professor at a college that teaches Bible. I am an Old Testament professor. I should be at church. But he said, I couldn't keep going in and singing songs about how great God is when I'm at home screaming at him about why he's hurting me and why he's putting us through this. He said, I just wanted one Sunday where I could come in and I could just weep. I wanted one Sunday where we could sing a song about God's faithfulness in the midst of a struggle, but every song was about rainbows and butterflies, and I couldn't take it anymore because my life wasn't rainbows and butterflies. But he didn't give up on God. He trusted in God, and God gave him a family. Now, not through childbirth. They had to find a different way, but they adopted children. They have a beautiful family now. God filled their life. And he can say now, God, I was struggling, and I had questions, and I had doubts, and I had fears, and I had anxieties. But I held on, and you came through. You know, sometimes God's faithfulness to you will show up through the love of another person. Sometimes you just need someone to cling to you. Sometimes you just need someone to love you in the midst of your struggles, to be there for you. And sometimes you need to cling to someone else. Someone needs you to be their Ruth. Somebody needs you to cling to them and say, you know what? I'm going to ride through this storm with you. I'm going to walk this road with you because I love you, because I'm loyal to you and to your God. The first chapter of Ruth ends like this. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law. And then listen to this one little verse right here, this one section. Arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. They arrive home. Naomi's back with her people. But she doesn't feel pleasant anymore. Remember, her name meant pleasant. Instead, she feels bitter. Mara. She doesn't even feel like the same person anymore. She says, "Don't call me that. I'm not pleasant. My life isn't pleasant. My life is bitter." She feels empty. But here's the irony. She says she's empty, and her redemption is standing right next to her. The way God is about to turn her story around, the way God is about to perform miracles in her life and provide for her, is standing right next to her in the person of Ruth. She can't see it. She can't understand how God's about to work, how God's about to move, but He is. It's already started. And there's this final line. And they arrived in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. You know, I'm not much of a farmer, but I am from Indiana, so I grew up around corn everywhere, as far as the eye can see. Just corn. You take it for granted when it's just everything's going right. When it rains 2 or 3 times a week and waters the crops, and the temperature's not too hot outside, the harvest just feels like it's what happens. But when you go through a drought, or you go through a famine, you go through a heat wave that burns off the crops, and suddenly nobody knows how they're going to be able to provide for their needs. Suddenly, when the harvest does come, it doesn't feel like just an everyday thing. It feels like blessing. You might have taken it for granted for the last 20 years because, of course, we're going to have harvest. But when the harvest comes after the famine, you rejoice. It's the same harvest. It's the same thing, but when it's been taken away for a little bit, you start to realize how valuable it really was. And in life, that's kind of how it is. We don't really know how blessed we are until we start to experience a little bit of pain. I don't thank God enough for the health of my kids until they get sick, or until my friends' kids get sick. I remember being on the phone with my best friend when I found out his child had cancer. His newborn baby. I remember being on the other end of that phone call as the doctor walked in the room. I had no idea that was what I was about to encounter. I was on the phone with him. I was standing right here in this lobby. I'd been at this church for maybe 2 months. I had a 4-month-old at home, and he had a newborn. And they were at the doctor because their baby wouldn't stop crying, and they thought maybe he had an ear infection. So we're on the phone, we're making jokes, I'm just checking in to make sure everything's okay, and the doctor comes in, he puts the phone in his lap, he says, hang on just a second. He puts the phone in his lap, and I can hear the doctor say, it's cancer. And there was silence for a while, and then he picked up the phone, he goes, are you still there? I said, yeah. I'm still here. He said, did you hear that? And I said, yeah. I didn't have any cliches to give him. I did not know what to say. I just told him I loved him. I just clung to him. That's all I could do in that moment. I had nothing to say, but when I hung up that phone, I spent the next 30 minutes just thanking God for my children's health. And I hadn't done that in weeks, months maybe, because I just took it for granted. Now, thank God, God healed that little boy, and he's amazing. He is such a beautiful friend to my son Joshua. They're like best buds. They play Minecraft on the Xbox together. We don't realize how blessed we are until we start to lose some of those blessings. And sometimes we need to be reminded of the harvest and the joy that just the daily provisions of God are more than enough. In this first chapter of Ruth, we see pain that defies logic. Naomi did not deserve any of this. Not a single verse in this book of Ruth passes judgment on Naomi. We see loyalty, loyal love coming from an outsider, someone who doesn't have a reason. In fact, in order to go with Naomi, Ruth had to give up something, but she stays faithful. And we see a God whose providence is working in the midst of struggle and pain. It's working through hardship. Even when Naomi can't see it, she feels afflicted. She feels that God's hand is against her, but God's hand is actually working out good for her. Maybe you find yourself in Naomi's shoes. You feel bitter. You feel broken. You feel tired of pretending that everything's okay. The story of Ruth tells us that even when we can't see him, even when we can't feel him, God is visiting his people. God is working things out. When life feels bitter, stay faithful. Just to take a single step in the right direction. You don't have to have all the answers. Naomi did not have all the answers when she turned back to Bethlehem, but she got this glimmer of hope. There was bread in Bethlehem again. And so she began walking the long road home. If you're going through struggles, if you're going through trials, first off, it is okay to express your pain to God. It is okay to cry out to him. It's okay to ask why. It's okay to wonder. It's okay to doubt. It's okay to be afraid. God can handle that. It's not okay to pretend like everything's okay, and it's not okay to give up on God. Let him keep working, because harvest is coming. And maybe there's already someone walking beside you who's going to be a part of your redemption story. Maybe there's a Ruth standing right next to you, loving you, a friend walking through it that maybe you don't even appreciate right now. But you just need to see that they're always there. You're complaining a lot. Maybe you're complaining too much. Maybe in the grand scheme of things, your problems aren't really that big. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes we complain about things that aren't really that big of a deal, but they feel big to us, and that's okay. But your friend who could totally just not pick up the phone when you call, still answers every time and listens to you complain and loves you through it. Maybe you already have someone walking beside you. And listen, if things are going well for you, if life is good, if you're not struggling, if you're here today and you're like, this sermon does not apply, I hope it stays that way, first off. But secondly, then be Ruth. Be a friend to someone else in need. Turn to your brother and sister and just let them cry on your shoulder. Let them shout their pain into you. This morning, we're going to continue worshiping, and we want to worship in joy because we know that God's grace is moving and working in our lives. That He has not left us, He has not forsaken us, and He's going to turn this around. And so we can have joy in the midst of struggle. This is actually the amazing thing, is we can sing songs of joy even when we're hurting. Because we see stories like Ruth, and we can say, if He did it for her, He'll do it for me. If He worked it out for Naomi, He'll work it out for me. And there's part of this story that we're going to find out next week and in the coming days. But Ruth ends up in the lineage of Jesus. Through Ruth, an outsider, a Moabite woman, God brings about King David, who leads to Jesus. God will take your mess and He will turn it around. He will take your journeys far away into Moab and He will make them into a part of His redemption story for the world. He wants to use your life to be a message to others. Romans 8:28 says, and we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him and who have been called according to His purposes. No matter what you're going through, no matter what struggles you're facing, God is working out good. So let's stand together and let's sing together that God's grace is enough.
Yes, God's grace.